Let's see, the next question is, how many of the scenes in the book are fictitious? For an example, the scenes under the big tent with Reverend Potts and later his emergence at the reservation, those seem as if they might just be reporting. Just curious to know how much is fiction. Well, fiction is always pretending to be the truth, isn't it? And in the case of this novel, and I would think most novels, except with the exception of some science fiction novels, perhaps, I would think that everything is based on something that actually comes from experience. A writer is supposed to write about what he knows, and you know your experiences. Reverend Potts and the big tent. Well, that was really interesting. There was a spot down from the railroad tracks. When I was raised in Buckley, there was still railroad transportation to Seattle and Tacoma. There was a station house, and there were tracks all over town because of the lumber mills. And you could take the train and go to Puyallup. You could go to Tacoma. You could still travel by train. But by the time I was later in getting ready to go to junior high school, that had been taken over by the Greyhound bus people, and the train was just used for merchandise. But in the early part of my youth, you could travel it. And there was a lot of railroad property there, and usually a circus, small circuses would come to town and occupy that space, which was a big deal for us, especially when I was old enough to work and help set up the service, because then you got free tickets to things. But yes, the Reverend Potts isn't his name, of course. I don't even remember the name of the tent evangelist that came to Buckley. But by that time, I knew I was in my early teens by then, and I knew a great deal about Indian spirituality. I actually knew more about it than I knew much about anything else, because I'd spent so much time by then, on the reservation and talking with the grandmothers and visiting with the shaman whom I adored. I knew the basics of Judaism and Christianity. My mother's people had been Jews, and there was that kind of influence, and my father's people were Roman Catholics. And as a child, I attended vacation Bible school at the Presbyterian Church, and my mother was always involved in some kind of biblical studies at the Presbyterian Church with George Eccles, who had been a missionary and a minister who lived up in the hills above Buckley and conducted very progressive classes. He was one of the missionaries that worked with Albert Schweitzer. So it's that kind of progressive Christianity, even for the 40s. They're looking for the historical Jesus, that sort of thing. So, and my mother had attended Unity, even though her people had been Jewish. Her mother sort of practiced Unity and Christian Science, and my mother owned all the books, the good Unity books by Ralph Waldo Trine and Harry Emerson Fosdick, most of which I had read by the time I was 13. And so I had that kind of influence on a very liberal, not quite a metaphysical Christianity, but certainly not the kind of Christianity that in the novel Reverend Potts brings to the tent. And we really wanted to go and see it and hear it, because we had a Pentecostal church in town. It was sort of down by the tracks. It was a big kind of a joke among people who didn't go there. In my father's day, they used to, as kids like this, sit on the lawn outside the church and listening to all the hoot and hollering going on in there. Years later, when I was about 16, I developed a terrible crush on a girl whose family went there, and I figured out right away that if I wanted to get in her good graces, I'd better go there too. So I started attending that church. And by then it had settled down. They had a young minister who was uh, a quasi-intellectual and a much more conservative person than the previous Pentecostal ministers who'd been there. But I remember distinctly when we went to the tent show, and we knew this kid in school who was always carrying his Bible and always wanting to know if you were saved and always tried to preach. And so we went, and I tell you, it was just like going to a rock concert or something. The music was incredible, mostly kind of cowboy gospel music, but it was lots of fun and very exciting. And there was a spirit of celebration in the tent. And things got really kind of scary, though, when they decided that we needed to be saved and wanted us to go down the Sawdust Trail. And then, of course, the preaching of this minister was so unlike anything I had ever heard at the Presbyterian Church or in the works of Trine or Zydek or any of those. It was sort of bizarre and frightening, in my opinion, and judgmental and a little crazy. So we were really happy to escape all that. But in some ways it was amusing. And later on we would go, a lot to these things because it was something to do in that little town. But we'd sit way in the back and we could slip under the tent and get out whenever we wanted to. And it was true that later this same evangelist, or one like him, wanted to hold a big revival, they called it, on the reservation. By then, Grandmother Red Wing had, I can't think of whether she'd moved into her house yet or not, but I remember that Saddle Seedco, or the guy who really was the shaman, would have been willing to let them on, I think, except the guy was so rude. And because there were certainly Christian services held on the reservation, both Catholic and Protestant, and many Indian people, especially the older people, practiced both their native spirituality as well as their Catholicism or their Protestant faith, which was pretty run-of-the-mill. I guess they don't call it run-of-the-mill, they call it mainline Methodist or something like that. So the confrontation between the medicine man, who was as a limp wrist and but profoundly bright and charming, and that minister was really quite funny. But as to your question, there is the entire book is fiction. It's fictionalized. Characters are compound characters. Even my characters the Fritz in the book isn't just me. But most of it is written from experience of actual things that happened. Even though it was a small little mountain town, it was, and not the crossroads of the world in either trading or goods or a seaport town. It had its moments and its great and wonderful things to keep one busy, especially before the dawn of television and when we were looking for things to do as kids in that town. Most of the situations are true.